This is from the Military Times, and this is a very grim and interesting um, point, in terms of what's going on right now. One could say this could be the beginning of the point of no return. And so we have, says Louisville chief, police and National Guard enforcing curfew fatally shot a man after someone in a group fired at them. And it says that this article is from 8 hours ago. So it says Kentucky's governor on Monday called for the release of police video from a deadly shooting that took place while police officers and National Guard soldiers were enforcing a curfew amid waves of protests in the city over a previous police shooting. The city's police chief said the man was killed early Monday while police officers and National Guard soldiers returned fire after someone in a large group fired at them first. A witness said the group had nothing to do with the protest and was shocked to see soldiers arrive to disrupt their gathering. Never thought I would experience that here in America, Christmas said. Governor Andy Beshear said there's significant camera footage, body camera and otherwise, from the shooting, and pressed Louisville police to release the video as soon as possible. So again, this is a sort of a very grim milestone in the unrest that has been occurring just in this last week. It's amazing to think that we weren't talking about this at all a week ago, about any sort of riots or anything. Of course, we did talk about things that were going on with the lockdown protests and things of that nature. But I did want to make an interesting connection here that I think other news outlets are not really making. So we can see where this happened, right? This happened in Louisville, Kentucky. And I have another article here just to kind of give people a reminder that when you start thinking, like we were talking about the Huntington Beach situation a little while ago, and that somehow the lockdown protesters should be put in a completely different group than the George Floyd protesters. But here's where Louisville also made the news, and we talked about this before. Judge rules in favor of Louisville church, says mayor's ban on drive-in surface criminalized Easter. So this is only from, a few weeks ago that we were talking about these kinds of things. And it's kind of interesting to me that I don't see many news sources connecting these kinds of stories together, and the fact that they are connected, and that there is a similar thread that runs through both of these stories. Because in one situation, you have these protests that are going on, and to various degrees, they're turning violent, right? And then on the other hand, you have something like a church that was trying to meet in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which experts say is still ongoing. We're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has not stopped because of the protests. It has not stopped because of the riots. It hasn't stopped because of any of those things. And so it's interesting to me that these connections are not being made in terms of these two stories. We're kind of being told that these two stories are not related to each other. And to me, they are. To me, they absolutely are. They run a common thread. And it's just interesting to me that we have these two very grim milestones in these two in the same place, in the very same place. It was a flashpoint in terms of religious freedom, in terms of religious rights, and now it seems to be a flashpoint in terms of people's right to assemble and the right to protest. What do you think of that, Pete?
I'm having trouble connecting a shooting with prohibiting people from going to church.
Well, the First Amendment includes your right to peaceably assemble, and it also includes your right to worship. And that's the connection, that's the glue, just as it also includes freedom of the press. So these things are all connected in the First Amendment. And when we see controversy, when we see these fundamental rights being challenged in different ways, under different circumstances, obviously, but obviously in the same jurisdiction, I think that's something that should be pointed out. And that's something that's not being pointed out in the mainstream media. Instead, what we get are similar to the story I talked about earlier, the Huntington Beach situation, where it's like, well, the lockdowns are one thing, George Floyd is another. No, they're not. No, they're not. They are both liberty issues. They both involve the First Amendment. They both involve the application of the First Amendment. And you don't get to pick which parts of the First Amendment you like and which parts of the First Amendment you don't like. The coverage towards this story, when we talk about the Louisville church situation versus the coverage of this other story of this grim milestone where we've had an incident where the National Guard and police have shot somebody, they're absolutely connected in my mind. They're absolutely connected 100% because it all has to do with our liberties. It all has to do with our freedom.
Well, that's certainly true. And yeah, I found it strange the amount of contempt that has been hurled at people who just want to go back to church. And we saw the Supreme Court this week ruled that, well, even though in Louisville, of course, you're now allowed to go to church again, the Kentucky court, the Kentucky judge struck down that order preventing people from going to church in Kentucky. But in California, the Supreme Court has now upheld that you cannot because it's within the governor's broad powers. And as we've said, this has been ongoing for months. This isn't an emergency order. This isn't what anybody would consider a legitimate emergency order at this point. What we're doing is allowing governors to make policy for months on end with very little judicial review, without very little restraint by the courts on what they can and cannot do. We're just handing them a blank check. Whatever you think is necessary, go ahead and do it. And that's absolute madness. Typically, you would think the standard would be something like this, that the policy or the law, the executive order, whatever it is, the instrument, it has to be narrowly tailored to achieve the government's aim. You should have to achieve the aim of, say, keeping people safe from COVID or trying to tamp down the riots in the least restrictive manner possible. And instead, what the courts have largely said, not always, not unanimously, some judges have been very reasonable on this, but what many of the courts have simply said is, you know what? We're not going to get in the way. Whatever you think is necessary, go ahead and do it. And that defeats the purpose of, we live in a free society. We live in a society where we have this Constitution that ostensibly is supposed to protect us from arbitrary government like this.
I do want to point out, or I actually want some clarification, Pete, because I did hear about the story in California, but I didn't get into it in depth. That was the California Supreme Court that ruled in that particular case, correct?
No, it was the U.S. Supreme Court. John Roberts was the deciding vote. He was the swing vote. So it has gone as high as it can go.
That's shocking. That's I wasn't aware of that. No, I wasn't aware of that. So I guess Roberts once again does not know what the Constitution actually says. It honestly disgusts me because you can, again, my point is you cannot pick and choose what part of the First Amendment is important to you and what part is not. That's not the rule of law. The First Amendment covers freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and it covers freedom of worship. And if you're going to allow the press to keep doing their thing, you've got to let churches still do their thing. If you're going to allow protests, you've got to allow the other two. It's you don't get to pick and choose your parts of the Constitution that you like. That's just not acceptable. And it infuriates me that's become the status quo in our country, where people get to pick and choose.
Yeah. I think the Supreme Court is very hesitant to strike down laws or regulations or executive orders unless they feel very, very strongly about it, unless it's a very clear-cut case, because they don't want to be seen as a policymaking branch. They're trying to preserve the image of neutrality, meaning they're not picking sides between the parties, but of course their loyalty should be to the Constitution, not to the political status quo or the middle of the road wherever we are politically right now. That's their job, to apply the law as it is written, as it was originally intended.
But
And
these aren't even laws. These are emergency declarations that, by their
right,
nature, are supposed to be temporary.
right. But the
They're not.
Constitution is the Constitution though is the supreme law of the land, and they're not applying the Constitution as it was written, as it was originally intended by its authors, by its framers.
It's very disappointing. Very disappointing.
Yeah, and we've said, I think when we first talked about this, we said, okay, the first step is you take this to court, but of course that isn't the end of it. If you're still not seeing progress, then I think the president or somebody, Congress, should look into other avenues for reining in these governors and mayors from doing what they're doing, because it is unconstitutional. And if the courts aren't willing to say so, um, there are levers that Congress may have at its disposal, or the president. You've said, hey, the federal marshal should go in and arrest some of these people. Well, maybe that's what you have to do. Unfortunately, because the courts have already ruled this way, the chances that the law would be enforced as it's as properly understood. Because what's the end game here, right? You arrest them, you take them to court. The courts, which have already said this isn't against the law, are they going to rule that person guilty or not guilty? It seems pretty clear the courts are going to would rule against the U.S. Marshals in that case. And so I think, I think there are some things that they could try, but their options are very limited now, unfortunately.
Well, there's only one option, which I would call the nuclear option, and that's to declare the state an insurrection, and then the federal government can essentially take over. That's really the only option you have there if the Supreme Court has already ruled on the issue. So
now, what would that entail if you have an order of insurrection? Where does that authority come from?
I believe it's a very old law. It's from, like, I think 1807. I was actually reading an article about that not too long ago, because that discussion has come up quite a bit in the midst of COVID-19, and then of course it's come up quite a bit in the midst of all these riots. How the Insurrection Act works and the application of it. There's actually a fascinating story from George W. Bush where he talks about the Katrina situation and why he did what he did, and what his alternatives were. And he talked about this in his book, that his only alternative to overriding the governor and also the mayor, because the mayor of New Orleans did not want the federal government involved. They didn't want to listen to what the president at that time was trying to advise them to do. And he said his only real option was to declare an insurrection, and then he could just send the military in and evacuate the city and do whatever he wanted at that point. And he knew he would have been crucified for doing it, and that's why he didn't do it. So, and then of course he was criticized afterwards for not stepping in and doing anything. But that's the only way you can do it. That's the only way that you can, as the president of the United States, that is your only real recourse in a situation like that, is to declare an insurrection. And at that point, you can use the military, and it becomes military rule. It's again, like I said, that's very much a nuclear option at that point. But I don't know. At this point, it seems like the world is getting crazier and crazier. The country's getting crazier and crazier, and I don't know. That could be in the realm of possibility at this point. So we'll just, I guess, have to see.
Yeah, speaking of the world getting crazier and crazier, I've spent the last week, I don't know if you've been following my social media activity this past week, but I have spent a significant part of the last week trying to tamp down just crazy urban legends. People are posting things without even bothering to read the articles. So one of the big stories was the Minneapolis mayor has said that most or virtually all of the protesters who have been arrested have come from out of state. And it was a story on MSN.com, and I had at least two people share it with me. No, three. And these are people who are politically formed. They should know better. But if you actually read the article, At the very top, it said, update. Turns out this is all lies. Turns out, once the reporters actually asked to look at the arrest records, these rioters are coming from within Minneapolis itself. But people have these narratives, and they're allowing their imaginations to run away with them. And so again, this is the thing. It's fanfic. This is fanfic where people are just taking shreds of stories. Hey, you have monkeys over here, and you have COVID over there, and you have rioters, and George Soros, and Bill Gates is going to drive around in his white van selling lollipops and vaccines. And, it's just so crazy. The president tweeted this. 80% of the rioters are from out of state. No, they're not. Now, if you're going to ship in rioters to instigate violence in a city, wouldn't you ship in like a couple dozen max? Wouldn't that make more sense than trying to fill an entire city full of paid protesters? Just get somebody to work the crowd a little bit and whip them up. But people are losing their minds. They're believing things that just on paper are not even plausible. So
well, I think where that comes from is exactly what you're saying, is that there's a sense, and I think there's a legitimate sense, that many of the provocateurs, if you will, and the instigators of violence during these protests are not people that are representative of the community. And by that, I mean they don't live there. That's what I mean. I mean, they don't live in that particular area where they're rioting. This happened in my own community where we had riots right down the street from my house. And the fact of the matter was many of the people involved were from out of state. In fact, that was well documented. I even tagged you on one of those particular people that was clearly from out of state. And
actually, it was Jake Paul, the influencer. So he's a millionaire. He's a boxer. He's in town. He's bored. And what does he do? He riots.
So the fact of the matter is that there's clearly that element is there. The question becomes how much of it, and that's where I think it becomes exaggerated when you say something like 80%. Of course, it's not 80% of the people there are from out of state, but clearly there are people from out of state, or at least people that don't live in that community. That's the other part of it, is that's how things get exaggerated. Clearly, there are people participating in these protests that don't live in that particular community. They don't live in that neighborhood, for one, or they don't live in that particular city, and they may not live in that particular state. And I know that for a fact because of what happened here. So that's just, and those kinds of stories, of course, end up getting embellished. It's kind of like the telephone game, right? You start with one message, I say it to you, you say it to somebody else, and it becomes more and more distorted as it goes down the line.
Right.
The issue that you were talking about, it was the mayor that at first was saying these people are not from my state, and you would think the mayor, being the closest official, the one on the ground level, that he would know what he's talking about. You would assume that. I would assume that the mayor is the best person to talk to about what's going on. But of course, what happens so often is we don't realize, well, how involved is the mayor? Where is the mayor getting his information? Is the mayor even getting his information from anybody, or is he just making things up? That's the problem that we have. And of course, that gets to the very core of a lack of trust in government and a lack of transparency, because oftentimes we don't know where they're getting their information or anything like that. And because again, you would expect the mayor to be well informed. If there's a riot in their city, that would be the person to talk to and find out what's going on.
Sure. And the people he blamed, he threw the police department under the bus. He said the police department gave him inaccurate information. I'm not sure I believe that. I can think of a few reasons why the police might want to lie to him. That is, they're trying to deflect blame, I think. But I think the truth is, so that's just a theory. I don't think that's what happened. I think what happened is the mayor wanted to deflect blame, and so he blamed it on out-of-state protesters, because then he doesn't look like he's losing control of a city. If it's outside nefarious forces brought in by George Soros or whoever you think wants to instigate riots inside of Minneapolis, then it's not his fault.
Well, the the latest spin on that has been that these are white supremacists. I don't know if you've heard that story, but that's all over the place, that there are white supremacists marching right next to these George Floyd protesters who are predominantly black. Somehow they've infiltrated the movement, and they're the ones causing all the problems. And that to me is just ridiculous. I can't see how that situation could possibly occur.
It does seem kind of far-fetched. I thought about that, and I thought, well, maybe what's going on with that, if you're a white supremacist and you really hate black people, you want to cause trouble in black communities, you see that there's unrest, you decide that you're going to stir things up a little bit because you want something bad to happen to black communities. I don't know. That's all I can think of. But it does seem rather
it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous notion. I've seen video where you can clearly see people that are clearly they're clearly the anarchist type. They're clearly the Antifa type, predominantly white, and they're even giving directions to black men in the crowd to do things. I've seen video of this. Sure. You know what I mean? So there are provocateurs. There is no doubt that there are provocateurs. But every single community has this. We have our own local anarchists here in Arizona, in Phoenix, and they're part of the same game there. You have this sort of merging, right? There's the Black Lives Matters folks. Their sort of movement. Then you have anarchists. You have Antifa. You have all these different groups. Yeah, I don't think the KKK is involved. I really don't. That's just my gut reaction of what I've seen and everything like that. They're just not there. They're not present.
Yeah.